I'm a Community Learning Development, otherwise known as CLD officer with Education Scotland. So this is coming from a CLD perspective, but I'm aware, there's a wide variety of partnerships out there. Some of you may be working with CLD services, or some of you may be working with partnerships that are delivered using CLD approaches, and I'll go on to say a wee bit more about that. But what I've got up on the screen here is the values of community learning and development, and these are values that have been identified by the CLD Standards Council, which is the professional body for those who work or volunteer in the CLD sector. And I'm sure that these values ring home for all of us on the call today. And if we think about family learning and parental engagement, working with families, working with children and young people, particularly for me, it's the one around inclusion, valuing equality of opportunity and outcome, empowerment. I know sometimes that can be a bit of a sticky word, but when we're thinking about working with individuals and groups to influence issues that affect them and their communities through individual or collective action, and probably most importantly for this webinar, the working collaboratively value, that is something that is really a foundation to working in CLD, because we'll go on to talk about CLD as such a wide-ranging sector, and that includes collaborative work with participants, with learners, communities, the partners that we work with, which as I said, is really, really, really wide-ranging, and yeah, anybody really that we come into contact with. Now, as I said, I am joined by lots of colleagues today. I'm in no means an expert on this subject. And I'm sure even Susan, who's our National Officer in Family Learning, wouldn't say that she knows everything. So, we're all in this together. As I said, this is a really informal session. So please bring your comments to the chat, or even stick your hand up if there's a burning question or a burning comment to make. And CLD is very much a values-based profession with its roots in social justice, which we'll go on to say a wee bit more about again. And just in case there's anyone who doesn't really know, CLD as a profession covers youth work, adult learning, including adult literacies, family learning, ESOL, wider community-based adult learning, and community development, community capacity building, community empowerment, and everything that's part of that. And the sector uses a range of formal and informal methods of learning and social development with individuals and groups. And CLD programmes are usually developed in dialogue with participants where possible, focusing on those excluded from participation, and really enables people to identify their own goals and engage in learning and take action to bring about change for themselves and for their community. As I said, social justice is really embedded in the world of CLD, and I'm sure many of you will have seen this image before. I think certainly up until maybe last year, I'd only seen the two pictures on the left, the equality and equity images, and was really pleased to see, this is from Dundee Science Centre, but really pleased to see when the third one popped up. And CLD's aim is very much to remove that fence altogether. And as I said, we do this by working alongside individuals and building capacity for them to do this very much themselves. CLD uses a social practice model rather than using a deficit model of learning, and not kind of deciding what learning people should get, and that idea of people not being empty vessels to be filled with our knowledge, but starting where the skills are already there. So when we're talking about family learning, what are the skills, say, amongst the parents and carers in the group? What are the skills of the children and young people? And how can we include them in the dialogue around what learning they want to be involved in and the impact and journey that this can progress them on? And really it's about kind of scaffolding the learning, supporting them to raise up and just as gently remove the scaffolding when they achieve their goals, but ensuring that the appropriate support and or signposting is there so that it's sustainable. I mentioned the CLD Standards Council, so this comes from them. This is the kind of CLD competencies in Scotland, and I'm just going to pick up on that, the top left-hand side, the phrase a diverse workforce, and I'm sure that whether you work in CLD or work with CLD, you really understand just how true this is. I think I've had about 15 different job titles in not that long a career. The family learning framework that I think Beverly and Susan introduced in session 1, and I think Julie's going to pop that link in the chat for you. It illustrates just some of the job profiles in the family learning field, and it's really interesting just to kind of get your head around, well, this might be my job role, but what does that job role, what's the title look like in a different area in Scotland? And it's quite mind-boggling how many different job titles there are. So these competencies are not necessarily new or unique areas of practice relating to family learning. However, they're key areas to think about, and I'm going to go on and have a think about 3 of them through a family learning lens. So the first one is all about know and understand the community in which we work. So whatever setting you work in, whether you work in a school, whether you work in a community centre, in a third sector organisation, you're more than likely linked to a geographical area, or you may well be working nationally, but with a specific group of people. And just having a think about that context, that's really important to CLD practitioners. You know, what does the community look like that you work in and work with? Is it built up or rural? Is it socially isolated, or does it actually have great transport links? We know that that links to poverty, and rural poverty is a really big thing for some areas. What is the housing like? Is it council housing? Is it privately occupied, rented? Is it a mix of all of this? What do the SIND stats look like? And I'm sure for a lot of you, this is really, really key, and you know, your bread and butter, and you think about this every day. But it's just bringing back to that kind of understanding what the community, the school community, the community that you're linked in with, what does that really look like? What are the different individuals and the different groups that make up that community? What are the key links? I've got a bullet point in there about key links to policies, such as making maths count, STEM and inclusion. For those of you who are either working in schools or are linked to schools, where does that come into it? What individuals and groups are kind of involved in those things, thinking about STEM and the links with gender equality? How are we making sure that people have access to the opportunities through those policies? And how is the work being recorded? You know, there'll be what we might think of as more formal family learning programmes, and then there'll be some more informal family learning programmes. How is that being recorded? How is that kind of whole community approach to family learning being recorded? Particularly, again, for those of you in schools, if the work is happening outside of the school but has an impact on the families of your school, how is that being recorded? And I know from experience that's a really tricky thing to do. And you get into conversations about sharing data and sharing information, and it's not an easy one, but I think it's a really, really important one so that everybody's on the same page. And the image just down on the right-hand side, that comes from a recent What Scotland Learned paper that Education Scotland published, which we'll see a wee bit more about in a minute, but that's just a little sketch note that colleagues came together. That was kind of the main points that came out of our What Scotland Learned case studies around the importance of community. So there's just some things there about working relationships have been strengthened and the significance of the wider community. And really what's happened through COVID is there's been a real kind of collective urgency to work together at pace, and maybe where that red tape and bureaucracy existed before, it hasn't over the past. I was thinking where we are right now, we're probably about 13, 14 months it feels like, although I'm still back in March 2020 in my head. The second competency I'm going to touch on is the idea of develop and support collaborative working. So again, we've touched already on how important that is. Do you know your partners or your potential partners? Again, depending on the community that you're working in, your group, your organisation, your school will directly link to a whole range of organisations. And I mean, I've got some bullet points here of just a few. You will be linking with anything from welfare rights to community learning development adult learning groups, to gardening groups, to organisations where you might be signposting families, voluntary organisations such as Bernardo's, when you're thinking about family learning. So there's so many out there, and I think that's something that people can struggle with, is actually you don't know what you don't know, and it's quite difficult to map all the different organisations that we can be working with. Colleges is something that, as a formal organisation, can offer real progression in terms of the adults taking part in family learning, and just having a think of, well, how well linked in with that are we, you know, at the end of the family learning? Is there opportunities for progression in terms of that kind of thing? And is there further opportunities to work together? You know, what other family learning practitioners are in your area? Is it appropriate to work together? There could be, you know, kind of similar groups happening. Would that work not better, but would that be able to run together so that there's kind of two heads are better than one, and perhaps engage more families? And really, overall, how are we kind of breaking down barriers to families engaging in family learning, and then enhancing that kind of community integration and the community engagement links? So I know that there's lots in there, and I'm aware that I'm kind of skipping over lots of information, but I want to get to our presenter who'll give you a real life example. Excuse me. And lastly, just before we move on to a local example, build and maintain relationships with individuals and groups. So that's, again, kind of part of collaborative working. But I'm sure for many of you, and certainly ask any community learning development practitioner, and they'll say it's all about relationships. I think I'm really bad for saying that all the time, but I genuinely mean it. It's about the relationship between staff, the relationships with families, the relationships with the parents and the adults in those families, with the family as a whole, with the siblings. It genuinely is all about relationships, and who has that relationship with the family. I think for some of us, it might not always be us. It might be somebody working in the community. It might be somebody in the nursery if you're in a school. It might be an early years practitioner. It might be a youth worker who works with an older sibling. And I think it's really important to have a think about, well, who is the best person to engage with that family, whether it's around parental engagement or family learning, and then kind of work together to make sure that everyone's on the same page and that the best outcomes can be met at the other side. It's been really, really interesting to hear how relationships have strengthened over the last 12 to 14 months. I think for some schools certainly are telling us at Education Scotland that relationships with some families have become more positive, and they've actually felt some families have engaged who might not have before, because they don't have that physical barrier of stepping over the school gate, if you like. They're actually quite comfortable to engage in things online, and that's something that Jane will pick up on in a minute. And some practitioners have continued doorstep visits where that's been allowed. And, you know, that continued kind of relationship, particularly at that time when restrictions were so tight, was that relationship continued through daily check-ins on the phone, by email, or by these doorstep visits, as I say, when restrictions slightly loosened. And are we making the most of those relationships, whoever that person is who has that relationship with the families?